Okay, so we are going to look at the difficult Part E question on the first paper, Christian Beliefs, Teachings and Practices. And we know that the Part E question is worth 50 marks. And if it's got a little asterisk next to it, it means there's another 3 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So over half the marks for the A, B, C, D and E questions come from the Part E question alone, so it's super crucial. And the question, our example reads, Jesus' incarnation is the most important teaching in the Christian faith. Discuss this statement. In your answer, you should analyse and evaluate the importance of points of view, referring to common and divergent views within Christianity. Refer to sources of authority and wisdom. So the task is quite clear that we need to look at different points of view, analyse, so we're looking at different ones, and evaluate, so we're weighing them up. It's asking us for some sort of judgment regarding the points of view, not necessarily our own opinion on the topic, but our opinion of the pertinent points regarding the topic. So it's not asking you whether you think Jesus' incarnation is the most important teaching in the Christian faith. It's asking you what you think is the most important argument. I guess thereby you can depersonalize it. Slightly different to the second paper with the Part D question, which is worth 15 marks, where in the discussion you might well include a personal point of view, but say how a Christian would respond to it. Okay, so our first point of call when we're answering this question is our introduction, and the goal of our introduction is simply to show that we understand the question, that we understand the statement without repeating it. So my introduction reads, from the ancient teachings of the Old Testament to the monumental teachings of the New Testament, Christians can draw on a wide array of teachings. There are a multitude before taking into account the creeds and then the endless supply of teachings from church leaders and other authority figures. To choose the most important is almost impossible, but the statement demonstrates that some regard the teaching of the incarnation of God as man in the shape of Jesus as the most important. And so we've said there at the end of that paragraph what incarnation means. Incarnation means that God came to earth in the form of a human being, and that human being was Jesus. So Christians believe. So I've said, look, I understand that there's debate about what the most important teaching is. That's a big question in itself. And I've also said, look, I also know what Jesus' incarnation means. I get what we're talking about. And so the person that's marking this answer, this response, is already happy that you know what you're talking about, can kind of start to relax and just look to give you marks. Making the first point and a point in agreement very clear, I'm going to begin by saying many would agree with the statement, alerting the marker that there's a point coming. So, many would agree with the statement, as undoubtedly the incarnation of God as Jesus is of enormous importance. The virgin birth described in the Gospels demonstrates the power of God and also fulfills the prophecy of a Messiah to lead the Hebrews. I've made it clear. I've given a bit of evidence, the virgin birth. I didn't reference it. You don't need to reference it all the time. And of course, the virgin birth is described in 2 of the Gospels and in detail, so it's quite difficult to reference. So a second point also to support the statement. Again, I'm flagging it up to the person marking my paper that there's another point coming in favour with my very first words of the next paragraph. Others would also agree, as the incarnation provided humanity with the unique insight of experiencing the perfect human being. The teachings of Jesus, for example, at the Sermon on the Mount are still very important to Christians, and indeed many Christians respond to moral dilemmas in their daily life by considering what would Jesus do, brackets WWJD, and that's a consideration that many Christians have in their everyday life. So what we're saying here is that the incarnation is incredibly important because it provides a template for Christians to try and match. Wrapping up my paragraph, without the teachings of the Incarnation, Christians will not have the example of Jesus to aspire to. To really reinforce my point, I'm going to actually give a further argument in favour of the statement. In further agreement, and again I've flagged it up to the examiner, there's another point coming up in favour of the statement, so get ready to give me the marks, Mr. Examiner. In further agreement, many Christians would point out that without the Incarnation, there also could not have been the crucifixion. By having a human life to sacrifice, Jesus atoned for the sins of humanity, and now through the grace of Jesus, humanity is offered salvation by God. Furthermore, not only did Jesus have to be a man to die, he also had to die to be resurrected and demonstrate the power of God over death and the triumph of good over evil, giving all Christians hope that they may be resurrected to spend eternity with God. And so that really is, probably my biggest point so far. It's the crux of it, that without the Incarnation, without God coming to earth as a man, Jesus, and Jesus' subsequent crucifixion and resurrection, there could have been no atonement for the sins of humanity, and also there had been no demonstration of the power of God over death, the victory of good over evil. And without these things, realistically, there would be no Christianity. Jesus is Christianity in that respect. Now I want to give some balance to the debate, I want to give some balance to the argument, so I'm going to look at another point of view. And again, I'm going to flag it up with my first sentence to the examiner. There's a contrasting point coming up. Here we go. Naturally, others may disagree. Some may point out that the teachings of the story of Adam and Eve act as a reminder to avoid sin or face catastrophic consequences. Indeed, had Adam and Eve avoided committing the original sin, there would have been no need for the incarnation of God as a man, and the fall would not have happened. So the contrasting point here is that perhaps the most important teaching would be the need to obey God, the need to follow teachings to the letter. It's not the strongest point, so I'm going to make some others to reinforce it. Other Christians might point to the teachings of Paul in Corinthians as the most important for Christians. After all, faith is a personal matter, and Paul teaches Christians that the means to being rewarded by God is simply to have faith in God. Paul makes it clear that God has granted salvation to humanity, so now Christians are clear what they must do in order to be rewarded by God. So maybe that's the most important thing to Christians, and certainly maybe at a personal level. What do you mean important to Christians or important to Christianity? Well, undoubtedly Jesus is important to Christianity. Well, maybe the payoff for Christians is that notion that they can be rewarded by God, that there is some payoff for being a committed Christian. I'm going to come with a contrasting point again, keeping that discussion going. Remember, discuss this statement. Refer to common and divergent views within Christianity. That common view, the central view about Jesus, and from Jesus flows Christianity, would be the common point of view, but divergent ones as well. You could even talk about the self-interest for Christians in wanting to ensure that they've gained that salvation for themselves. Perhaps that's most important for Christians. So a further point. Others would disagree and say our actions in our earthly life are of the utmost importance. They might point to the parable of the sheep and goats. This reminds Christians that God reserves particular judgment for everybody when they die. Those who have not sinned and are judged worthy by God are rewarded with a place in heaven. Those who are judged by God not to have met expectations are not rewarded, and some Christians even think they may be punished with eternity in hell. Although the story of Jesus' resurrection is the cornerstone of Christian faith, this parable reminds Christians of perhaps the main reason for being a Christian, to be rewarded in heaven. So there I've linked it into that idea of the self-interest. While Jesus' incarnation is important for setting up the kind of conditions for being able to be saved, it's still now up to each individual Christian to make sure they do what's required to please God. So I've kind of given the discussion's kind of gone almost quite circular, really, and brings me to a conclusion. In conclusion, It is impossible to deny the primacy of the teaching of the Incarnation of Jesus. Simply put, without the virgin birth there would be no crucifixion and resurrection. The two great festivals of Christianity would not exist, nor would the two most famous miracles that demonstrate God's power. The crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension are the foundations of Christianity, and all would not be possible without the incarnation of God as Jesus. So my judgment there, my conclusion, and again, I've not brought in a personal point of view about the most important thing. I've just said which I think is the most important teaching. So my judgment, my evaluation is of the points of view, not my point of view. But of course I want it to be rigorous, so I want to recognise there are problems with my points of view, that I've not just solved these age-old big questions, that I've not come up with the answer. So I'm going to recognise a weakness or a criticism that might exist of my point of view. Here we go. Others may dismiss my view, pointing out that it could be any teaching from the Bible or simply a local religious leader that prompted a believer to feel the presence of God, or that was really resonant for them to be the most important for them. Indeed, differences of opinion regarding key beliefs have already led to great splits within Christianity. It's impossible to say which teaching is most important to the individuals, groups and denominations that make up Christianity, but without the Incarnation, Christianity would certainly be a very different faith. So I've wrapped it up. To be totally honest, that's the criticism of my conclusion, that Christianity, religion, faith is deeply personal, different for each individual, is to some degree quite hard to refute. If we take it down to that personal individual level, how can one person say that somebody else's truth is incorrect? It's quite personal, and how different people feel their faith obviously varies hugely. But we have answered the question. We have analysed and evaluated the importance of points of view referring to common and divergent views within Christianity. And of course we have referred to sources of authority and wisdom, church leaders, we've referred to different parts of the Bible, we've referred to obviously to Jesus, but also the Old Testament and the New Testament. Making sure that our spelling, punctuation and grammar is good, we should be able to return 15 to 18 marks for that response. So let's hope that question comes up, and if it does, we're laughing. Brilliant.